I should warn you that this presentation includes images that include nudity and victims of war, and if you're of a sensitive disposition you may choose not to watch this seminar. Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador, and in this session I want to take a look at how we can be inspired to do greater work by looking at the photographs of others. Now, there is a 195-year legacy of great work out there, so we should certainly be looking beyond places like Instagram and Facebook for that inspiration. Now, I'll be taking a look back at some of the photographs throughout history that have inspired me to do greater work. This photograph of Florence Owens and her 3 children captured by Dorothea Lange is part of a much larger body of photographic work that helps to document the American Great Depression. Now, only by looking at the more images in this body of work, not just this single photograph, which is a bit of a classic, do we learn that it takes more than one image to create a story. Now, for me, it also helped me to want to step outside of my comfort zone and approach complete strangers and, with their permission, help tell their particular stories. Here I'm photographing Julia on the streets of Melbourne, and this is a street artist called Raphael, also on the streets of Melbourne. Now, I do have to be encouraged or inspired to move out of my comfort zone, because it's not something that I would do easily, and so by looking at the work of great photographers who have done this throughout history, I get the inspiration and motivation to do the same. Now, if we return to that body of work, Dorothea Lange was working with other photographers, and they are often referred to as the FSA. They were employed by the Farm Security Administration. Now, all of their images are public property. They're stored by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and you can get access to this full body of work. Yes, you could buy maybe a coffee table book as well, but you can look at these images online. If we look at these 3 very different photographs, we can see how they collectively can work together to help build that narrative. We have sort of a location or an establishing shot. Where is this activity taking place? In the lower left hand corner, that image by Margaret Bourke-White, very powerful as a standalone photograph with a food queue standing underneath a poster of the world's highest standard of living. But of course, it's also very important to approach people within that story, so this becomes very personal to some people's lives within that story. And if you look at my own work when I started my career, this is the last project that I did at Photographic College. Again, you see that establishing shot. Where are we? There's a town in the Rhondda Valley. What is happening? We're looking at miners going to work, and then we get the individual portraits of people interacting with the photographer, which is great for increasing the power of a documentary story. Now, as I started looking at photographs, I also started finding people who wrote about photography, and this was very important. I found some people were very eloquent in the way that they discuss photographs, and it helped me to look deeper beyond the surface of the photograph to see how those photographs actually worked. And I'm going to quote this. This is by John Sukowski, who is a great figure in photography, in that he sort of helped create photography, or the importance of photography, as not only as a documentary medium but also as an art form. Now, he was director of photography at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and in one of his books called The Photographer's Eye, he has this very short passage that introduces a chapter to help us look more deeply about how some of these photographs he's showing us actually work. So I'm just going to read through this. To quote out of context is the essence of the photographer's craft. His central problem is a simple one. What shall he include? What shall he reject? The line of decision between in and out is the picture's edge. While the draftsman starts with the middle of the sheet, the photographer starts with the frame. The photograph's edge defines content. It isolates unexpected juxtapositions, By surrounding two facts, it creates a relationship. The edge of the photograph dissects familiar forms and shows their unfamiliar fragment. It creates the shapes that surround objects. The photographer edits the meanings and patterns of the world through an imaginary frame. This frame is the beginning of his picture's geometry. It is to the photograph as the cushion is to the billiard table. Now, I found this quite a powerful piece of writing because I'd never really considered the edges of the frame when I was making photographs until perhaps I'd actually read this statement. And when I started looking at what John Zagofsky had said about the frame, it helped me compose images and frame my subjects with a little bit of thinking behind that. So let's take a look at some of the passages in context. This is not a photograph. This is a painting by an French Impressionist painter called Degas. Now, if we look, remember John Zagofsky's words: the edge of the photograph dissects familiar forms and shows their unfamiliar fragment. If we have a look at the ballet dancer on the extreme left, we'll see the frame dissects that ballet dancer in two. Now, in painting, this had never really happened before. We never had a painter that put the edge of the canvas through somebody that was standing on the edge of the frame. And only by the French Impressionists looking at photographs and looking at how that frame worked with the content inside were they inspired to sort of think again about that frame. And so when we're looking at these French Impressionist paintings now, we don't see what the hullabaloo was all about, really, because we've grown up watching TV screens where the edge of the TV screen often and nearly always dissects familiar forms. But as we start looking at how those shapes are created by the frame, then that can sometimes influence the way that we do either crop in post or frame actually on location. So let's take a look at the words "it creates the shapes that surround objects." If we look at this image on the left by Aiko Hoso, you might see that there's two shapes, when in fact there's actually three. There's the negative space on the extreme left behind the man's back. So we not only have the knee or leg of a woman with fair skin and the dark curvature of a man with darker skin, but we also have that third shape. And if we look at the image above the words, there's not just the three shapes, there's the negative space, which also creates those important shapes within the frame. So when we look at these as pieces of art, we see that without that frame as a compositional tool, these images wouldn't necessarily work. It also helps us to crop a little bit tighter than sometimes we might do, rather than always stepping back so the subject in its entirety is always within the frame. We can with confidence realize that it is okay to dissect a shape with the edge of the frame, because sometimes it creates a more dynamic image. This is quite a disturbing image to look at. It's a survivor of a Hutu death camp by James Natray. So not only do documentary photographers want to get the story, the narrative down, but they also use compositional techniques to increase the power of their story. If you've ever heard James Natray talk about the importance of his work, it's certainly something that would inspire you. A lot of people question why war photographers are out there doing what they do, but James Natray has thought about what he does very carefully. He's not just a trophy hunter. He actually believes implicitly that his work can make a difference to the outcomes of lives who are affected by either famine or war. Framing this tightly has obviously increased the power of the image. A lot of people notice that I do actually frame my head and shoulder portraits quite tightly as well. But I think this composition by James Natray is also very brave. you often hear a compositional or design tool which says you should always have a person looking into the frame rather than out of the frame. But of course, James Natchway has broken all of the rules here. He doesn't really want you feeling comfortable with this composition. In fact, the complete opposite is true. He wants you to be shocked by this image, and so he's used quite a brave compositional tool where this young black man is looking out of the frame, and so the focus is all on the injuries, and you can see that powerful negative space on the left side of that frame. So if we take a look back at compositions, perhaps one of the masters of compositional photography is Henry Cartier-Bresson. And again, looking back to John Sukowski's words, by surrounding two facts, it creates a relationship. How much we decide to draw back or crop in by either cropping in post or zooming in with our feet is going to change the narrative or how people read the story. Now, there may be other people sitting on seats watching a concert in a park on the local bandstand, but Henry Cartier-Bresson has decided to crop in quite tightly in this image. So there are only two things for us to read. One is the woman lying back on that bench, and the second fact that we learn from this are the empty seats. And so a little message might come in. We start reading into this is maybe this woman is lonely. Why is this woman by herself? Why is no one else in that park listening to the band on the bandstand? Again, if we are reminded by John Sukowski's words, by surrounding two facts, it creates a relationship, helps to remind us that it's not just about the subject that we want to photograph, it's what's behind the subject or what's next to the subject, because we can often change the communication by changing the framing. This is a very powerful example of that. For instance, a photographer has photographed two posters on the brick wall here, one of an advertisement for stockings and another one a charitable poster to collect money for a famine. Now, each has its own meaning, but when framed together in a single photograph, a new, more powerful meaning emerges. In this photograph, also captured by the famous photographer Henry Cartier-Bresson, we see a decisive moment captured, a split second where the composition is just right. Now, Henry Cartier-Bresson was one of four founding photographers of the famous photo agency called Magnum Photos, and we'll be taking a look at other work by other Magnum Photos shortly. But in this image, this decisive moment captured, we see the importance of that split second timing for creating the perfect composition. Now, Henry Cartier-Bresson also created a book called The Decisive Moment, full of these images of where this split second timing certainly created the perfect composition. If we take a look at this image photographed at Gare Saint-Lazare, we see the guy striding also is reflected in the water. Also, the metal hoops in the water also repeat that striding shape, and also the poster on the background there is of a ballet dancer also making that striding shape. So you can see how the split second timing here was perfect for the subject matter and framing of this composition. And if we look at some other Henry Cartier-Bresson photographs, you'll see that Henry Cartier-Bresson looked at this beautiful shapes of this stairwell and the road arcing in the background and figured that this composition was just short of one moment, and that would be the passing cyclist. So you can sort of imagine Henry standing at the top of the stairs waiting for that cyclist to appear and then firing off the shutter just at that right time where that cyclist occupies that negative space there between the stairwell and the far side of that road there. And again, you can see another example of that decisive moment. Beautiful architectural shapes captured in Greece here, and what we're just missing is that focal point just in the right space, and of course that is created by that girl running up those stairs there. So if you're looking for more examples of this perfect timing and composition, then certainly check out some more of Henry Cartier-Bresson's work. Again, in this other example, also by Henry Cartier-Bresson, I think the wall with those small windows and the children in the foreground certainly is interesting enough, but it doesn't really make the perfect photograph unless we have that guy with the hat striding towards the left there. And again, that occupies the perfect space within this composition and is the focal point for this photograph. Perhaps one of the photographers that set the benchmark really high for other documentary photographers or photographers trying to create visual narratives or stories was the Magnum photographer called W. Eugene Smith. Now, he often worked with magazines such as Time, Life, and with the Magnum Photo Agency. Apparently, he was quite a difficult photographer to work with. He always got a little bit cross when magazine editors didn't use enough of the images because he'd put a lot of work into his photo stories. So he moved on from Magnum and he moved on from many magazines during his career. If we look at one of his more important bodies of work, which actually became a feature film starring Johnny Depp, it's called Minamata. He decided to go over to Japan, where he heard that a community of people were being poisoned by the local factory releasing contaminants into the water, and these people were fishermen and they were eating the contaminated fish, which in turn led to huge disfigurements of their children. Now, he worked with the local community to help stop the factory releasing those contaminants into the water. This very powerful shot of a woman bathing her son in the bath is hugely poignant about the problems that this community faced. And of course, the much larger body of work really helped that community take that company through the courts for recompense. Now, one of the most powerful portraits that I've seen a photographer do is by the famous portrait photographer called Arnold Newman. This is a photographic portrait of Alfred Krupp. Now, you might go, well, this is not that good a photograph. He's made the guy look really unpleasant. But if you look at the backstory behind who the photographer is and who the person being photographed is, you realize what the photographer is up to. This is a Jewish photographer from second generation poor migrants, and he's been asked through his perhaps magazine to photograph this German industrialist who was responsible in the war for using Jewish forced labor, and he was tried the Nuremberg trials after the war for these crimes against humanity. He did serve a few years in prison for using that forced Jewish labor. So of course, when Arnold Newman is asked to photograph this person who he instantly already doesn't like, he uses the technique of lighting to present this industrialist as a very sinister character. So you can see how the power of the photographer through his lighting technique has created the narrative or communication that he exactly wants to convey. Perhaps one of the photographer who is obviously showing their people in a much better light here is this Magnum photographer called Bruce Davidson, working just one street in New York City here, East 100th Street, and this became one of his landmark photographic books that he released. Now, if you look at the people being photographed, they're obviously quite well aware and working with the photographer for those portraits to be told. And a great quote from Bruce Davidson, which sort of inspired my own work, is the comment which he said, "I didn't want to be the unobserved observer. I wanted to be with my subjects face to face." So if you look at that body of work, he's never trying to be the fly on the wall, working unnoticed. He's always working with the people, completely camera aware, basically working with the photographer to tell their story in this particular part of New York City. So that's definitely a body of work that has inspired me, and maybe will inspire you to interact with people to tell their stories for you as well. Now, it's not all seriousness or doom and gloom when we're looking at bodies of work by these Magnum photographers. There's one Magnum photographer called Elliot Erwitt who's certainly got a way with creating these very humorous images, and a lot of them involve dogs, I have to say. He is a serious photojournalist or documentary photographer in his own right, but when not being commissioned, he often just walks the streets of particularly New York, capturing these very unusual images that are full of humor. And again, just this image of these three sets of legs, the very large dog, the woman with the boots, and then this little dog on the right there. Very humorous, well-framed image. And again, this image also captured by Elliot Erwitt in an art gallery. You can see that Elliot Erwitt has noticed this painting being removed for perhaps cleaning, so all he had to do was stake out this spot, waiting for people to view the notice. And obviously what has made this really powerful is the painting to the left, which is observing the people reading the note. And so you can see how this photographer really works the craft of street photography in order to generate humor. Perhaps one of the photographers that has influenced me in the way that I frame some of my imagery is an English photographer and also a Magnum photographer called Ian Berry. This is from a book that I currently own, and it's the title of this is captured in a hospital in London, and it's called Waiting Room. You can see how this image works on multiple levels. The foreground with the people seated, the people in the middle distance standing, and then leading through to the little girl holding her mother's hand there in the distance. You can see how we can construct or be looking for structure to our images that does exist on these levels, that builds a more complex image and helps build depth into what would otherwise be a two-dimensional surface. This Ian Berry is obviously working as on documentary projects, but also as a street photographer, this time not in New York but in London. This one captured in England in 1992, and again this is a photograph that exists on multiple levels, 3 levels to be precise. That foreground, the middle distance with those children up on the higher bank there, and again the housing or offices over there in the distance. Now you can go over to the Magnum Photos website. It's a rich resource to view a lot of photographers' work. One of the reasons this work, being a photo agency, is for sale. You can buy it as for art prints or for work that you want to put in books that you're writing. This Magnum Photo Agency, though, is not just about viewing the work of photographers. You can also view the contact sheets of the films that they were shooting leading up to the hero image, and you can also see examples of how the photographer has instructed the printer to dodge and burn areas of the image lighter or darker. You know, this work that we do to modify tonality by making certain areas of the image lighter or darker is not new to Photoshop or Lightroom. It is something that photographers have traditionally done throughout the history of photography. We're well aware how making certain areas of the print lighter or darker can certainly influence narrative. This is a very famous image of James Dean by the photographer Dennis Stock, another Magnum photographer. Here's another photograph that is hugely influential to me, and again goes back into that tight crop to reduce visual distractions. Now, a lot of people who maybe want to photograph a portrait of a father and child would step back until we can see both figures. But you realize that by cropping in very tightly just on the child and the hands encircling the child, this is still a powerful image of a father and child, even though we don't see the face of the father. In some respects, it's even more powerful than had we stepped back and building in more unwanted negative space and perhaps even more distractions. So this powerful way of getting in close and using a tight crop either in camera or in post, is a powerful tool that I've certainly learned by looking at the great work of other photographers who came before me. For instance, this photographer working in this Cambodian refugee camp, you can imagine a very busy sort of environment with lots of distractions, and so this might even be a set-up shot between somebody working in the refugee camp and this small child. In order to get a simpler composition and therefore more powerful photograph, is using the side of maybe one of the tents in the refugee camp as a background or a canvas backdrop, and just again having the hand of the care worker leading in, flowing through that leading line through to the child's face. Again, this is something that I might do with a wide aperture such as 1.4 or 1.8, but again, if we're working with stop-down apertures, there are still tools and techniques we can learn from the great masters about how to make the narrative easier to read and perhaps more powerful. Again, a case of less is more. Here again, another case of less is more. This going back to this portrait photographer Arnold Newman, we saw him photographing that German industrialist previously. Now we're photographing a musical composer. Now he was asked to photograph him, and of course there's all sorts of options when you have to photograph somebody in their natural environment. Here he's chosen to work with the composer at his grand piano. Now up there in the right hand corner, courtesy of the agency he's working for, we can see the original framing of this composition, and we can see that cropping in much tighter was a decision he made in post-production, not in camera. Obviously he's being given a number of options by shooting slightly wide and then cropping in much tighter. Now one might question, why has the composer been relegated to the bottom left hand corner of the composition? And you can see what's going through the photographer's mind here is the open grand piano looks like a huge musical note, and perhaps now we're reading that the music is much more important than the composer himself. And so we can see again the power of simplicity to create this beautiful composition of just two powerful elements against the plain walls in the background. Perhaps one of the photographers who has managed to pull off a very busy environment is this photographer who is called Sebastião Salgado. He was on a long-term, I think it was a 6-year project to photograph workers around the world. He noticed in his previous job how prices of commodities were getting cheaper and cheaper, so he wondered what the impact on the people who resource these commodities were. If you view the many stories in this very large book of workers captured from around the world, you get the idea that Sebastião Salgado is presenting these workers as very heroic figures, often working with for very little money in very harsh conditions. Now, some might say it's very easy to be a jet setter and go around the world and photograph such great and interesting locations such as this. This is a mine in South America. But there are other photographers who turn the camera in on themselves. A British photographer, a Magnum photographer called Martin Parr, doesn't jet set around the world all of the time. He'll often turn the camera to the middle classes in the UK, of which he is a person who was brought up in the middle classes. Perhaps this is even harder to do, is to look at the people around us and think them worthy of taking photographs of. If we look at this book called The Cost of Living, we might see that Martin is not trying to build these figures as heroic either. Sometimes he's very critical about these people. Now, there's no words that says what Martin thinks of these people, but just by looking at the series of photographs you often see these people caught up in their lives, which revolves around money and status, is often a complete contradiction to what Sebastião Salgado was doing by going around the world. And so by looking at this body of work we can see that there are stories right on our own doorsteps if we can see them. And here is another image by Martin Parr. He often turns his attention to different attributes such as tourism, and you can see that the thing that the tourists are photographing are not what Martin Parr finds interesting. He's stepping back a couple of steps and taking the people interacting with these tourist locations. When we see some of Martin Parr's portraits, obviously the people are willing to be photographed, but I'm not too sure how they thought that they would come across, because if you look at Martin Parr's work, people are not often made to look heroic, or it's not a flattering portrait you're going to get of yourself if you allow Martin Parr behind the camera. Same thing with landscape, and I've taken a picture of Mount Fuji with industrial foregrounds as well, but you'll see this picture of Mount Fuji. He doesn't take the classic chocolate box cover of landscapes either. He's looking for a deeper level of communication than just taking things at surface value. Let's take a look at the work of now another photographer, also a Magnum photographer, called Steve McCurry. Now you might be familiar with this image. It's often been said that this is the most famous portrait photograph ever taken. It's called Afghan Girl, and it was the cover of National Geographic magazine one month. Now inside those National Geographic magazines you're going to see those extended visual narratives, those photo stories. They used to be popular in lots of magazines, but now it pretty much is just National Geographic who decides to carry on using the work of extended photo stories to convey important information about a particular story that they're covering from around the world. Now Steve McCurry, you can see his work is extremely colourful, and I think perhaps that is something that inspired me. When I first went off on my own travels, I used to load one body with Kodachrome transparency film and another with black and white film, but when I got to India, which is a very favourite location for Steve McCurry, I also could only see India in colour. I couldn't really see portraying India in black and white, and so both of my cameras then took colour film, one with slow Kodachrome and the other with a higher ISO Ektachrome film emulsion. Now Steve McCurry has landed himself into hot water. There is a lot of debate about some of his photographs. A lot of them you assume to be natural moments in time captured, such as Henri Cartier-Bresson, but some of them are almost too good to be true, and that is the case with some of Steve McCurry's work. He has defended his own work, saying they're illustrations to convey an idea. He never said that they were captured without the cooperation of the people within their photographs. He's also used Photoshop to remove distracting elements in some of his photographs, which again is, for some people, they don't believe that a documentary photographer should do that. Certainly photojournalists are not allowed to do that. They're not allowed to use Photoshop to remove or add elements, but as Steve McCurry said, he's not a photojournalist. He's an illustrator. He creates these visual narratives. So I put a link in there to the retouching debate if you want to look at that in any more detail. To give you examples, is that image in the top right hand corner is one of the images that is almost too good to be true, because Steve McCurry made the train back up one or two times until he got the perfect photograph for this shot with the Taj Mahal in the background. Steve McCurry also was given the last roll of Kodachrome. This is a famous film emulsion, ISO 64. You could get a slower ISO 25. With that last roll, he started taking images in New York, but then jetted over to India to complete that roll of film. And so there's a whole backstory to Steve McCurry shooting that last roll of Kodachrome film from Kodak. course, one of the reasons that many of the photographers I've been showing you are using black and white is because the fine grain emulsions for color were so slow. ISO 64 is very challenging to work with in low light ambient conditions. So one of the things that you can learn from a photographer called Ernst Haas, also a Magnum photographer, is that not being able to freeze action at a bullfight, he's just used these very slow shutter speeds to create these impressions of motion and activity. And so this is something that we can learn from. We don't always need razor sharp images when we're photographing with film emulsions. We can be a little bit creative with the materials that we're currently using. Certainly one of the areas that we're most exposed to is not just these hero photographers from photo documentary and photojournalism and art photographers, but also advertising. We're more likely to consume more advertising photographs on any one given day than any other type of photograph. And some of the budgets for these advertising photographs are so high that the photographers who are working to create these visual narratives often have the world at their oyster. They can really dial in the weather that they want and the characters that they want to appear in their photographs. And of course there's often a lot of visual humor, because humor is a great way of selling product. And so this is a great way to learn how to create visual narratives by using the tools and techniques of photographers. Now, it's not everybody who's going to resort to Photoshop to create this, but it is a tool, just as it was a tool for Steve McCurry. It is also a tool to create work that you can't capture within a single frame. The backstory behind this image is the magic waters in Tasmania, which leads to this great tasting beer. And of course the dog has dived into the water to get the stick and has become a different dog. Such is the magical properties of these waters. Now, I grew up in an era where cigarette advertising was still allowed in the UK, but of course what happened as the years unfolded, the rules and regulations guiding how photographers could advertise cigarettes started to change. You couldn't show people smoking the cigarettes, you couldn't show people having a good time smoking the cigarettes, as people started realizing there were health concerns linked to the smoking of cigarettes. So this didn't stop the advertising of cigarettes. In fact, something really strange started happening. Advertising started to become surreal. These advertising photographers started using the visual narratives or tools and techniques that the surrealist painters had used going on before them. So we have some very strange work here. 3 packets of cigarettes, and when they're reflected they become 3 flying plaster ducks going up the wall. And then in the image on the right, the packet of Benson and Hedges, the reflection being the reflection of a parrot and not the packet of cigarettes. And here is some of the work of one of the surreal painters, René Magritte, here working with his surrealist subjects. Now, when asked repeatedly what was going on in René Magritte's paintings, he painted this picture of a pipe, and underneath it the French words saying, "This is not a pipe." And obviously people looking at it going, well, of course it is. You've painted a picture of a pipe. How can you then say it's not a picture of a pipe? And basically he's saying it's a painting of a pipe. It's not the actual pipe. So I'm free to twist and distort reality where I see fit in order to create new meanings behind the work you're looking at. Then, of course, what happened with the advertising of cigarette packets is they weren't even allowed to show the cigarette packet. But this didn't stop Benson and Hedges from advertising Benson and Hedges. Here we'd be looking at the shavings of a gold pencil, and everybody knew it was an advertisement for Benson and Hedges, even though we could no longer see the packet of cigarettes. One of the competing cigarette companies also started creating these works where people had to try and discover what was actually being advertised. So the image, the inset in the top left, is a piece of silk that has been cut, and of course the brand that we're looking to advertise is a brand of cigarettes called Silk Cut. Smooth smoking cigarettes, which they're not allowed to say are smooth anymore, so they use smooth, fold, undulating silk to convey the idea that their cigarette brand is silky smooth to smoke. And then, of course, when it was easy to read, they couldn't just carry on advertising that same piece of silk that was cut. We had to sort of start pushing the bar higher by making people work harder to try and work out what was going on. So when looking at the larger of the two images, a lot of people would be looking at the image trying to work out what that little piece of white paper with the little purple dot actually signified. And it was only when you were able to get back from the very large 24 sheet street poster would you realize that the folds of the silk were creating the outline of a man's face. And then as soon as we realized it was a man's face in that undulating silk, we realized that the man had cut himself shaving. So again, we get that feel-good factor that we managed to work out what the cigarette manufacturer was actually advertising. And that feel-good factor, the fact that we managed to work it out, is why the cigarette advertising actually worked. I'll just go back to that image and say that Silk Cut were actually sued by a chocolate manufacturer for using that exact color purple in their advertising. This purple is very associated with the chocolate manufacturer Cadbury's, which also used the word smooth tasting chocolate. So that smooth going with that underlying color of purple was obviously another tool the cigarette manufacturer was actually using. This has led certain manufacturers to copywriting a smell, a sound, or a particular color linked to their advertising. Strange, but true. We got to this very controversial work started appearing by Benetton, United Colors of Benetton, which sold basically just clothing. And we got work that people really couldn't understand why a clothing manufacturer would use this imagery to promote their clothing. The image on the left is the woman is actually wearing a piece of Benetton clothing, but then they actually stopped using the clothing in their advertising altogether. Now, most of these advertisements ended up getting banned because they outraged certain elements within the community, whether obviously it be Christians in the bottom right there with a nun kissing a priest, or just that very confronting image of watching a newborn baby covered in blood. A lot of these advertising would only last a day or two before being made to be taken down. But of course, some people said that that was the nature of what Benetton were trying to do. They were trying to create controversial advertising so people would talk about their advertising. Oliviero Toscani had a different idea. He basically said that a lot of people used to get their moral compass by looking at the frescoes inside of cathedrals and churches, but of course now the new frescoes of life were up on the billboard hoardings in the actual street. So Benetton were just funding these discussion points about important aspects of society so people could talk about them. Of course, other people said, no, that's not why Benetton are doing this. Benetton are just going for the controversial factor so people are talking about our company. Again, this was hugely successful for the company. The company moved into Formula One racing, which is no cheap affair. So again, this powerful imagery, whether you hate it or love it, is certainly an important part of photographic history. Well, certainly an important part of my photographic history as I was growing up. We've looked at commercial photographers and we've looked at documentary photographers. I want to take a look at some art photographers now, people who earn quite a lot of money from just selling a single image. And we're talking not hundreds of dollars here, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars for a single piece of work. This is the very famous Gregory Crewdson. Now he works with budgets which probably replicate those advertising budgets. So this whole street scene is basically been illuminated and lit and staged just for this moment in time. It's almost like a still from a movie that we've been watching, but this whole thing has been staged and set up and then captured on a large format camera. Now he doesn't tend to use Photoshop, so everything that is in that shot has to be set up, whether it's the car in the distance, the car in the foreground, the suitcase on the road, the guy standing in the rain. A lot of questions are asked because we can't often resolve what is actually happening in this, but it certainly leads our imagination to run riot to try and build a backstory behind this single image. Another art photographer who actually doesn't describe himself as a photographer, he describes himself as a sculptor, but the only evidence of his sculptures is a piece of photographic work. He photographs his sculpture because his sculptural work is very ephemeral. Basically, it will be gone the next day if a wind picks up all of those yellow leaves. Now, this isn't created in Photoshop. He basically moves into a location or environment taking nothing with him. And he basically makes and fashions tools or collects and then moves certain elements within that given location in order to create a new understanding of that location. Something that would never happen naturally, but only using natural elements. So you can see the inset picture on the bottom right there. He is basically creating a sculpture out of wooden sticks that he's finding in that actual location. He hasn't arrived with a truck full of sticks. He only uses the materials he finds on that location. And then to document that work, he takes a photograph. And so really the photographs are documentary photographs of an ephemeral piece of sculpture, and then these collective works then are sold in books and in galleries. And if you look at this body of work, it certainly would be inspiring for some people who don't relate to the typical chocolate box landscape work, but really don't want to just take something that has been captured a million times before, because these pieces of work are quite unique to Andy Goldsworthy, but they could influence another photographer or another sculptor in very important ways by viewing this body of work, something that you may never have got the idea without viewing another photographer's work. Here is an aerial view looking down called Inversion, captured by Anthony Crossfield. Now I've seen other photographers replicate this style. I've even seen this exact image replicated with using a woman and a different room. You can see this was very influential to a lot of people. In fact, the whole idea, if you were to Google levitation and photography, you would see a lot of people have been inspired to create these frozen moments using tools and techniques, and you can certainly work out how these photographers pulled this off, because these techniques people have explained how they've achieved or come to the end point using photography and multiple exposures. Another art photographer called Peter Funch, he's photographed what looks, all intents and purposes, like a street photograph, but when we look at him, it's not a single decisive moment that Henri Cartier-Bresson would choose to photograph. These are almost too good to be true. In fact, they are too good to be true. They are frozen moments, but Peter is basically standing in the same place at the same location, but they can be 1,000 separate moments that then taken and then composited into a single photograph. And so these are, can be considered, quite clever in that they look natural street photographs, but you can see there is a thematic approach going to these. This one is I really enjoy looking at. This one is obviously everybody in a hurry these days, and or looking at mobile phones. That would be another subject for Peter to look at. So many people using their mobile phones, but of course the thing that is the focal point in this image is the only person who is not striding. Again, I'm reminded by that Henri Cartier-Bresson image of La Gare Saint-Lazare. Here we see the single photograph almost scratching his head, and we're thinking, what is everybody in such a hurry in this modern world? Okay, so here is another enjoyable one which is very topical for what we're doing here now, taken in Times Square. People and even the poses people get into to take a photograph, you know, crouching and bending, and Peter has managed to capture all of these individual elements and then composite them into a single canvas. And again, you know, another little focal point for me is that posters above the Reuters sign of that woman looking directly out towards us. The only person who is looking directly at Peter Funch's camera is a photograph of a person. And you can see if you go to if you find out these photographic artists or advertising photographers and go back to their websites are often a rich resource for ideas that you can get for your own photography or projects that you might want to undertake in the future. Let's go back to landscape photography. Now, a lot of landscape photography you'll see on Instagram and Facebook and Flickr. They're the sort of typical photographs where the landscape is the hero element. We see the majesty of the landscape. But some of the photographic artists who are gaining the most traction and their work is selling for the biggest amounts is not photographers who are making the landscapes look heroic or captured in the golden hour, if you like. They're photographs of landscapes which are very political in nature. So you look at the work of Andreas Gursky here, a German photographer, and you see this fabulous landscape covered in these solar panels, and this is making quite a huge statement about the landscape and changing times of landscapes in the modern era. So rather than looking at, say, Messerach, where we're looking at this photograph at this very critical moment as dawn rises at Messerach in Canyonlands. But of course this is not the reality, and so you might get somebody like Martin Parr doing a project on tourism, not really interested in the heroic image, and then wanting to stand back and photographing maybe the reality or the truth or his version of the truth to what is actually unfolding at these locations. And another example that I've used in a previous seminar is this Torii Gates in Kyoto. And everybody who's been to this location would say this is almost never empty of tourists, and so surely another way of photographing this would be the reality of what most people experience when they visit this particular location, which is almost more like a shopping mall of people crowding this beautiful location. So Gursky, in his approach, again looking at busyness perhaps in a photograph where some people will strive for simplicity, Gursky is looking for that crowded, busy nature, that repetition of detail that Peter Funch was also doing with collecting the same moment in his street photographs. And I've pulled out a statement from Gursky which sort of explains what Gursky is trying to do here. He's saying, I'm never interested in the individual, but in the human species and its environment. So he wants to talk about the human condition without actually putting humans into his landscape photographs. They're really talking to the human condition and the human species. So in many respects they're doing what Sebastião Salgado was in touring the world, creating those heroic figures of people. Gursky's doing it by his approach to landscape photography. another photographer that is working without that busy structure, in fact complete opposite, the Australian photographer Murray Fredericks goes to these particular environments or locations on the planet where they're stripped almost bare of any detail whatsoever. So here is Murray Fredericks working on a salt lake that's been flooded momentarily in Australia, but he's been flown out to ice sheets in Greenland, and his focus is on photographing these minimalist landscapes. And there is an inset picture of Murray Fredericks, who takes all of his gear out onto the salt pan, and often will stay out there for days on end waiting for the weather to change, because often when stripped out in these minimalist locations, the only thing that is interesting that is going to happen is usually to do with the weather. So I have used a couple of those photographs before, and a couple of other things that drives me to start working on particular projects is covered, and this particular video tutorial focuses more on my work. I've been focusing in this particular seminar on other people's work, but if you're wanting another side to the coin, if you like, of how you can be inspired to work on projects, is this video tutorial I've called Photographic Passion. And so again, this one is more than an hour long if you want to get some ideas about possible projects that you might want to look at covering yourself. So hopefully you've been inspired to go out there, not just looking at the photographers I've been looking at, but certainly go and look beyond Instagram, Flickr, Facebook for photographers who have undertaken very important projects of work or bodies of work, and you might get inspired to do the same, and you might also learn some tips and techniques about how to frame images and the sort of subject matters you can cover moving forward. Okay, hopefully you've enjoyed this session, and again, with all my seminars, just put some comments down on patreon.com or below the movie, and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible.